This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Alex White, Director General here at the Institute, and you're all very welcome. Those of you who are in the room who've managed to make it here in person, and those of you who are joining us online, equally welcome. Most welcome of all, of course, is our distinguished guest, Minister Neale Richmond, and I'll introduce him in a few minutes. And also I'm going to invite the Director General of Irish Aid briefly to come to, or in a moment, to come to up and address you. ODA, Official Development Assistance, has for decades played a vital role in addressing poverty and financing global development goals. But even before, I suppose, the current upheavals, perhaps we can describe them as, precipitated by the US administration's dramatic overhaul of US aid in January of this year, I think it's the case that up to 86% of US aid awards have been cancelled. But even before that, very, I suppose, for many traumatic event, the international aid system faced mounting pressure from shrinking donor budgets, emergent geopolitical rivalries, and the tendency to use ODA to meet a widening range of needs that it was not designed in the first place ever to address, including climate finance, critically important area, refugee costs, and global health security. So there are so many pressures. The preoccupation is considerable in relation to where ODA generally is going. There are different views. But so in the sense, development cooperation is at, I think, something of a crossroads. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Minister Richmond has to say, and to have the opportunity to hear from you by way of questions, either here or online. And I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. If you don't know how to do it, it's straightforward enough. But before we deal with those exigencies, it's my great pleasure to invite the Director General of Irish Aid, Michael Gaffey, to address you from right here. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Alex. Well, situated between you and the Minister, my function today is to be brief, and I will be very brief. I just want to first acknowledge all of you coming here today. It shows the interest that there is in international development at the moment. Unfortunately, some of that is because of the threat to international development at the moment, but the rest, looking around the room, is because of the very strong commitment still in Ireland, in the sector and in the public, to the work we're doing in international development. So really what I want to say is that this forum, this Development Matters series that we have in collaboration with the IIEA, was always important for us. But I think it's even more important in this day when we need to look at the place of international development in foreign policy, and where the actual sector is under threat. But these things, I am certain, come in waves. And by Ireland adhering to its principles and adhering to its programme and adhering to its concept of ODA, I think we will be there when the wave turns, and we will turn the corner. So just to say, it is a real honour to introduce today Minister Neale Richmond, who assumed this job at the most difficult time internationally that I think any Minister for International Development and Diaspora has had to do. And he has been extraordinarily active every day since then. And I want to welcome him today and give him the floor and say thank you all for coming to listen. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. Minister will speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have the Q&A, as I mentioned. If you're in the room, you just simply have to put up your hand to ask a question, and we have a roving mic going around, which will be very useful. If you're tuning in online, pop the question into the Q&A function that you'll be familiar with. If a question occurs to you at any time, you can put it in early because we can bank them and make sure they're there. And the sooner you put in the question, the more likely it is for us to reach it. And just a reminder that the presentation today and the Q&A are all on the record. You can use social media if you like. Use the handle at IIEA, #DevelopmentMatters. Can I, before I introduce the Minister, can I just especially again thank Irish Aid for their very close cooperation with us and collaboration with us in this series. It's absolutely invaluable. They're terrific partners to work with. I think I can say that without any hesitation on behalf of the Institute. We work very closely with Michael and indeed his colleagues, and it's great to see this series working so well again this year. Neale Richmond is Minister of State at the Department of Foreign Affairs with special responsibility for international development and the diaspora. He previously served as Minister of State at the Department of Finance with special responsibility for financial services, credit unions and insurance, and as Minister of State at the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment with special responsibility for business, employment and retail, and at the Department of Social Protection. Minister Richmond is a TD for Dublin Rathdown, a constituency with which I have some familiarity. And it's my very, very great pleasure to introduce and to thank him for being here and to give the floor to Minister Neale Richmond.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much for referring to the constituency that they say in EU terms that of which you know best. But no, it's wonderful to join you once again on a platform, and I want to thank you personally for your ongoing work and commitment to public debate, and indeed your many years of service on South Dublin County Council, in Shannon and Erin, and indeed in Dáil Éireann before your own ministerial stint. It is also a huge pleasure for me to return to the IIEA. The last two opportunities I've had to share some thoughts have been on Brexit and space. So now I'm going to try and go boldly somewhere where I've never gone before. No, far from it. Just before I go into the meat of the speech, and 20 minutes is optimistic, there's about 40 pages here. I've said this in lots of different fora, and I'm not going to repeat my remarks because there's a lot of familiar faces in the audience, but I can't underscore just how much I sought this role from the Taoiseach, and how this, for me, is something that I've been lucky to have a personal passion and commitment to for over 20 years, driven by many reasons that I don't need to go into. And you're right, it is an exceptionally difficult time to assume this brief, but from great difficulties and challenges, I believe there lie great opportunities. And I'd like to kind of go through that in a couple of stages this afternoon and hopefully let you out of here before this evening. Because, ladies and gentlemen, international development, to put it mildly, is facing a crisis. But even before the impact of major ODA cutbacks was clear, 2025 was scheduled to be a challenging and busy year with our engagement in South Africa's G20 presidency, the financing for development conferences in Seville, and COP30 in Brazil, which I'll touch on momentarily. So before I do that, allow me to reflect a little on the current global context, or indeed upheavals, as it's been referred to already. We are seeing extreme poverty increasingly as a function of conflict and fragility. Contexts experiencing high fragility are home to a quarter of the world's population, but account for 73% of the world's extreme poor. 30 years of progress in eradicating extreme poverty globally have been derailed by the compounding impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, ensuing economic shocks, debt, war, and conflict, and also the existential challenge of climate change. The most visible impact can be seen in displaced populations and the unprecedented level of need for humanitarian assistance. Over the past 18 months, we have witnessed the unfolding of a humanitarian catastrophe of staggering proportions in Gaza. Over 52,000 people have been killed, close to 120,000 injured, and 90% of the population have been displaced. Some of those have been displaced 13 times in the past 18 months. The World Food Programme reported that its food stocks in Gaza were depleted by April 25th. UNICEF has warned that children are experiencing severe malnutrition. 1 in 5 Gazans are now at risk of famine. At the same time, 2 years of conflict in Sudan continues to cause one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent memory, while the situation on the ground in Ukraine continues to be extremely challenging, to put it mildly. All of this comes at a time when the international aid architecture is facing great uncertainty, not least due to the recent decisions by the United States and other large donor countries to reduce their official development assistance. While 2025 will be difficult, it is expected that the situation will worsen in 2026 when many of the cuts are expected to take effect. There will be significant and growing funding gaps for international development and humanitarian organisations. We expect that the impact of the decisions will be particularly pronounced on humanitarian assistance, global health, gender equality, governance and human rights. US withdrawal from the World Health Organization, its termination of funding to the UN Population Fund and the possible defunding of the support for HIV and AIDS, especially in Africa, will have a deep and far-reaching impact. This government, however, is committed to maintaining and, if possible, increasing our ODA towards achieving the 0% target of GNI. We have consistently increased the allocations to ODA over recent years. The budget for Irish aid in the Department of Foreign Affairs this year is €810.3 million, the highest ever level. However, it is not feasible for Ireland or any other state alone to fill the major funding gaps that will arise from wider ODA cutbacks. As I think everybody in this room in particular would agree, global challenges require global solutions. Their range, complexity and cross-cutting nature means we must have a coordinated approach at both national and international level. In this respect, we welcome the UN Secretary-General's UN 80 initiative. This will look into first, efficiencies and improvements, second, reviewing the implementation of all mandates, and third, carrying out a strategic review of more structural changes and programme realignment in the UN system. From our perspective, we feel that the UN and its member states need a strategic, principled approach to change and reform that is guided by the need to deliver on the commitments of the UN Charter. The UN 80 initiative needs to make the system better and more effective, not simply cheaper. It is clear, though, that the political climate for reform is not benign or auspicious, but the stakes are too high for us not to try. There is a real urgency now to these efforts, and we will seek to see the shape of them in line with our values and interests. Most importantly, the normative role of the UN must not be up for debate. We are not going to join a process aimed at renegotiating what the UN stands for or what it does. That has already been agreed, most recently in the Pact for Future adopted last September. I'm aware that in certain circles, there is a fear that developed countries will bring a donor-centred approach to the UN 80 reform process. However, we should not let these concerns result in reticence when engaging with the reform process. The way to counter such perceptions is to work to build alliances and trust across all regional groups. Ireland, with the EU and its member states, should seek to understand the positions of other key partners, to work with them in support of their objectives where we can, and to present coherent, evidence-based arguments in support of our own objectives where our approaches differ. In a challenging and adverse environment, the development of trust is key. There are three interrelated key events I would like to focus on in 2025. The first is financing for development. 2025 is a key year for discussions in this area, culminating in the fourth Financing for Development conference in Seville at the end of June. There are a number of areas where we need to see progress, in addition to developed countries maintaining our ODA commitments. The first of these is the debt crisis. The conference needs to show a pathway for the global debt architecture to provide timely, predictable and fair debt restructuring and indeed relief for countries. This pathway should build on debt resolution tools that we already have, such as the G20 Common Framework, and recognise existing mandates. Trying to start again will simply set us back and create even more uncertainty at a time when the opposite is required. Secondly, developed countries, including Ireland, need to reinforce our support to domestic resource mobilisation, including increasing the proportion of ODA spent on building revenue and tax collection systems and a structured approach to strengthening their capacity. A third dimension is to address the proliferation and fragmentation of funding mechanisms across all areas, as varied as health, education, and indeed climate action. The current system enables a significant level of duplication and results in competition for increasingly scarce donor funding. More importantly, it creates complexity for all developing country administrations to navigate multiple funds and financial instruments. This points to the opportunity to recommit to the principles of development effectiveness. In all discussions around financing for development, Ireland is absolutely clear that we need to maintain a focus on reaching the furthest behind first. This includes focusing ODA more on where the world's poorest people live in the most difficult of environments. In 2025, the second major process is our engagement with the South African G20 presidency. President Ramaphosa's invitation is an important opportunity for Ireland to input into decision-making on significant questions of international policy. The South African presidency's intent is to revitalise and catalyse the drive towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly as development gains continue to be eroded. The focus is on global system transformation and governance for development, highlighting the universality, indivisibility and integrated nature of the 2030 Agenda. We are working alongside the South African presidency to press for solutions to significant development challenges in areas such as disaster resilience and response, debt sustainability, the care economy and a just energy transition. I will travel to South Africa at the end of July to participate in the G20 Development Ministers meeting, where we hope to finalise important principles around addressing illicit financial flows, introducing social protection floors and on funding for global public goods. The third key event is the 30th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP30. This will take place in Belém, Brazil in November. Brazil has described this as an implementation COP, with the focus spread over all key areas, including mitigation, adaptation, finance, just transition and capacity building. Ireland remains firmly committed to the multilateral process, which we strongly believe is the only viable avenue to address the triple planetary crisis that poses such a threat to the global community. While engaging in these processes, we will also be promoting Ireland's key priorities. And one area that hasn't been mentioned but I think will be prove an important part is indeed the UN General Assembly in late September. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about the looming presidency of the European Council. More of that in about 3 minutes. Ireland absolutely remains committed to reaching the furthest behind first, even as some others seek to redefine international development solely in a narrow view of their national interest. As we have seen, those living in extreme poverty are increasingly located in fragile and conflict-affected areas. We need to focus our interventions more effectively, with a need for greater investments in anticipatory action, locally led development and longer-term approaches to chronic crises. Strengthening governance and supporting democratic resilience are critical and remain central to Ireland's development cooperation. At a time when the international system to mediate and resolve conflicts is increasingly weakened and sidelined even by its core designers, Ireland has an important role to play. Building and cementing alliances with like-minded countries in Europe, Africa and elsewhere, we can work to bolster a more effective United Nations system and stand up for a rule-based international order. This, for instance, is why Ireland joined the South African case in the International Court of Justice. Furthermore, as we talk about reaching the furthest behind first, we need to think about disability inclusion. We have made significant progress in this area, admittedly from a low base, but we cannot overlook the grave challenges ahead, especially the risk of the erosion of the rights of persons with disabilities. Ireland has endorsed and was actively involved in the consultations to help shape the Amman Berlin Declaration, and we continue to encourage other government donors to endorse the declaration in an age of heightened caution around language. The declaration, which calls for full and effective engagement of persons with disabilities in all stages of development cooperation and humanitarian action, sets out 9 commitments with a 3-year period for reporting on progress. Today, I also want to take the opportunity to address the increasingly fraught subject of gender equality. Gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls remains a central priority for us in principle and as an absolute prerequisite for progress on the SDGs. We recognise the central role of women-led organisations in advancing equality globally. We are delivering on our commitments in a better world to increase funding for women's organisations, channeled through support to UN agencies and NGOs, but also in targeted partnerships. We place a particular focus on advocating for a survivor-centred approach to tackling gender-based and conflict-related sexual violence. We work with many varied partners, both civil and bilateral, to ensure that survivors have access to non-discriminatory, trauma-informed legal and sexual and reproductive health services. Our embassies directly provide support to programmes preventing and responding to gender-based violence. For example, the Rainbow Initiative, which I had the opportunity to visit while in Sierra Leone, supports over 50,000 young girls in their journey to healing from traumatic experiences through access to much needed health and recovery services. I'm going to take a little break here. I'm going to make a slightly personal comment before I talk about the next section and indeed moving on from GBV. I have a very clear fear that I hope is shared by the vast majority of people, that amazing progress and work, of which there's a lot more to do to achieve gender equality, to protect women and girls around the world, is going to be absolutely hijacked and sidelined by someone else's culture war. And this, I feel, is going to be the serious consequence of ignorant political action and hot takes that isn't going to be discussed enough. And I think we have a responsibility as a country who can look back with some shame in some regards on how we treated women in this country in particular, but indeed with some pride in how we are improving that situation. We can play a much more powerful role than perhaps we anticipate. And I take a very personal responsibility as a man in this position to make sure that my voice is just as loud, if not louder, than any others that have gone before me. And it is something that I think has to be a key point in a lot of our discussions. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Let's not ignore the angry voice. We can be frustrated by it, we can give out about it, or we can do something about it. And I think that's the most important area to focus on, because Ireland has invested in maternal and newborn health since the very, very first days of our aid programme. We continue to support this area of work because even now, over 700 women in poor countries die each day from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. This is not a DEI agenda initiative. This is basic humanity. Sometimes very simple interventions can have a huge impact on whether a woman or her newborn can survive delivery. In Tanzania, we fund training along with boots, coats and torches for health workers so they can get to pregnant women in hard-to-reach locations and ensure they receive the care they need. More than 60% of maternal deaths take place in conflict and humanitarian settings. In Gaza, for example, 5,500 women are due to give birth in the coming month. Over a quarter of these women will require emergency obstetric support, yet the health system is on the point of absolute sheer collapse. Ireland is the third largest supporter of the WHO's contingency fund for emergencies, which has financed the deployment of emergency medical teams into Gaza together with field hospitals, essential obstetric supplies and high nutrient food for severely malnourished pregnant and breastfeeding mothers. Despite the massive challenges, care services have reached up to 30,000 children under 5 and resulted in the safe delivery of 750 babies in 6 months. One area of maternal health that I believe demonstrates in real practical terms the significant impact that Ireland is having is in regard to preeclampsia. This is a treatable but potentially fatal condition to both a mother and her infant. Preeclampsia causes 46,000 maternal deaths every year and 500,000 miscarriages or stillbirths. Ireland has provided €4 million over the 3-year period, 2022 to 25, to the Clinton Health Access Initiative in Mozambique to increase the early detection of treatable conditions such as preeclampsia. Ireland is also supporting the use of innovative technology to diagnose preeclampsia in pregnant women. Early detection is essential, and in 2024, Ireland helped train more than 450 maternal health workers and screen over 115,000 pregnant women for preeclampsia. Our support helped save 5,000 mothers in 1 year. So the next time someone goes on Twitter or on the radio and says, why are we wasting money abroad? Ask them to look at their sister, look at their daughter, look at their wife, look at their mother, look at any woman walking down the street or a baby in a pram and say, why do you not want them to live? That's as blunt as the language has to be. The hot takes and distractions that are going to enter need to be countered by fact-based emotive responses. And I absolutely will not be quiet in that regard. And I think there's a reason for this, because the Irish development system has an absolutely brilliant opportunity to show how it works. Ireland has been a long-standing champion of the women, peace and security agenda. We know from our experiences the transformative impact women have had on the peace process, both in negotiating the political settlement and continuing the essential work of peace building today. We will launch Ireland's 4th National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security this year. We all know that Ireland has been a long-standing champion of global efforts to reduce hunger and malnutrition. I commit that we will continue to prioritise and address the needless scandal of acute malnutrition in children. In partnership with the WHO, UNICEF and Concern Worldwide, we have been delivering a child wasting initiative which aims to save the lives and improve the health of severely malnourished children in 10 countries in Africa. This joint initiative, to which Ireland is providing €50 million over 3 years, improves healthcare, supports social protection and addresses the root causes of child malnutrition. At a time of conflict, worsening food insecurity and a global malnutrition crisis, Ireland's leadership for nutrition remains steadfast. At the Nutrition for Growth Summit in Paris earlier this year, Ireland delivered an ambitious pledge to spend €250 million annually for the next 4 years to address hunger and malnutrition, €1 billion over the next 4 years. Irish Aid will work with its trusted partners to save lives, improve the health and malnutrition of millions of people, with a specific focus on addressing child malnutrition globally. I would also, therefore, like to speak about our priority to support education. We know from our own experiences that education is a key driver for development. It is also critical to achieving gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. During my visit again to Sierra Leone, I saw the benefits of ensuring there are teachers available in remote rural areas, while in Kenya, I saw how initiatives such as the Kenyan Young Scientist competition encourages girls' engagement in STEM studios. There's nothing more fun than standing in front of 2,000 teenage girls with a love for science, admittedly in 42-degree heat, with a small plane waiting to take off before a storm came in. But it is absolutely a wonderful opportunity to see it in action. Just before the end, as I promised, possibly 3 minutes ago or possibly 17 minutes ago, I'd like to briefly talk about our preparations for the presidency of the Council of the EU, which will come in the second half of 2026. This will be Ireland's 8th EU presidency, when we have an important opportunity to help, lead and to shape the work of the EU. It is safe to predict that we will hold a presidency in mildly uncertain geopolitical times, not least in relation to the global provisions and focus of ODA, and as the EU itself focuses on how private sector investment through the Global Gateway can be further mobilised to boost mutually beneficial trade and investment with developing countries. Negotiations on the next EU multi-annual financial framework, the 7-year budget, will form a central aspect to our work. On development and humanitarian cooperation, specifically, our approach will be to manage the EU development agenda well, but also to focus on those areas where we can make the effective contribution based on our values. I will conclude, therefore, by emphasising the need to continue to focus clearly on our core values and interests, because Irish Aid has a long history of working together with our partners to support their economic, social and political development, with a clear focus on ending poverty and hunger and addressing gender inequality. Participation in international fora, such as the Financing for Development Conference, is about showing that multilateralism delivers when it is needed the most. We remain strongly committed to enlargement at a time when showing up really matters, as we strive to deliver on our global commitments and revitalise the Sustainable Development Goals. Our international development policy remains central to our foreign policy. Ireland will remain a true, reliable partner for developing countries and vulnerable communities this year and into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenge we are facing in the international development sector is absolutely great. We're gone past existential crisis at this stage. It is a great challenge that needs to be met with not just enthusiasm and not just words, but real action. It's about using every tool or opportunity to demonstrate domestically and internationally that development is an investment. It's an investment in targeting the very real issues that the world faces today. When I went knocking on doors last year, an awful habit that Alex once had, a number of key issues were brought up in terms of rising food prices, rising energy prices, concerns about irregular migration. And when you bring all those together and much else, what do they come back to? They come back to global instability and the lack of development in the global south. So we have an option. Do we try and address those issues as they present themselves to our door, or do we tackle them at source? And this is why I make it quite clear that development is an investment. It's not just the right thing to do. It absolutely is the right thing to do, but it's also an opportunity to make sure that your selfish interests are met as well as your selfless ones. This is a case that far too many people have taken for granted. They don't want to get into the conversation. They don't want to tackle the mistruths, the disinformation, and the hot takes that are put about. But the days of just hearing that on the radio or seeing it in social media are changing. We're seeing it in European Council meetings. We're seeing it from the rostrum of the Oval Office. We're seeing it on a daily basis. And are we going to be aghast? Are we going to be upset? Or are we going to respond? The challenge is great. The opportunity is greater. I would ask you all, online and in the room, to please join us in the challenge to push back against the current. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think we can see from what the Minister has said how quickly and how enthusiastically he has taken leadership of this agenda on behalf of the Irish government. And I think also we pick up something of the passion that he himself has invested in this task that he has, a task that he has emphasized is for us all, but he has the leadership of. So I think we will certainly appreciate your presentation and perhaps look forward to some engagement with our audience now here in the room and also online. So I invite you to indicate by putting up your hand. I'll say in the room first. If you have a question for the Minister, we like to invite questions rather than comments, but occasionally comments and observations find their way into questions, and we understand that as well. So over to you. Yes, sir.
Just, Minister, you touched on the question of ODA target, UN ODA target. I'm just wondering, are we likely to accelerate the achievement of that, given, as you said, the dire need, particularly in hunger, but all across the issues you touched on? I'm just wondering, and I suppose this is a political question you touched on when you're knocking on doors where people give you feedback. Is there something we can do to change that dynamic and change some of that conversation? Thanks, Minister.
I should have mentioned that if you feel able to tell us your name and your designation, if you're representing an organisation, you don't have to be representing an organisation, but if you are, please say that and give us your name when you ask a question. Formally different. Very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Gramaga Brendan, I take the two aspects of your question separately. Just in relation to our own ODA target, we're at about 0.58% now of the GNI, and we are still absolutely committed to achieving 0.7%. I've been quite open, and it's of no mystery that I'll be sitting down with Minister Chambers and asking for an increase of our international development budget. I think at the very least we'll get a maintenance, and we'll see how that moves us towards. But we see more broadly globally the swinging cuts, the commitments in the UK to go from 0.5% to 0.3% show just how stark it is. And it's something that really requires that engagement, and it feeds into the political process and knocking on doors. Now, I live in South County Dublin, where there's an awful lot of retired diplomats living who seem to have an interest in development issues, which is quite convenient. But very good.
Good man.
So you didn't need your passport stamp to come over here like me. No. More seriously, there was a really good analysis put out by DOCUS in advance of the general election that was sent to all those seeking election that showed the real public interest and engagement in the development sector. Irish people, they're not unique, but I think we all can share from our personal experiences, we do have a particular interest in this area. And you can cite it going back to Biafra, you can cite it going back to the fact that our aid agencies are so established in the mindsets of the Irish population at large from a really young age. It can be doing the Concern Christmas fast, it can be Troca's Lenten campaign, it can be the Concern debates, it can be goalies collecting the traffic lights and Christian Aid and World Vision going around to so many different groups. It does resonate. And there is, I would argue, a very silent majority who unfortunately are a bit too silent, who genuinely care about this and really value Ireland's place in the world. And they are prepared politically to demonstrate that. We don't have a far right in this country of any scale. We don't have, when we had this debate at the Foreign Affairs Committee on Tuesday, there wasn't one dissenting voice about our development programme. Now that might change. But I think we have to look what actually is the real concerns out in the ground, what the real concerns are in the Oireachtas, and they certainly don't mirror the bile and victitude that we see on social media.
Down the middle there.
Thanks, Minister. Paddy Smith, Irish Times. I just wanted to know, you didn't really touch on it, but there was an emphasis a few years ago on Ireland supporting specific measures on food and on hunger, and we were engaged, I know, in a UN Secretary General subcommittee to push forward the issue. Is that still on the agenda? Is that still part of our work?
Yeah, and I suppose, Paddy, it's really gone into our work when it comes to nutrition for growth. Our commitment to, first and foremost, put the money up. Nutrition for Growth Summit was held in Paris. It's tied to the Olympics. The previous one was in Tokyo. We're going to meet our targets in relation to our spending on Tokyo ahead of schedule, and we've increased our target, as I mentioned, from about 235 million a year to 250 million a year because we see that the need is greater. Within that, the child wastage aspect is a massive part of it in terms of that theme. And we look to work within whatever programs are at our disposal or where our aid agencies are working to promote that. And it takes lots of different streams. There's one, it's working with young farmers in Kenya or Tanzania to increase the levels of productivity and increase the level of collected knowledge in terms of food production. There's our steadfast commitment to the World Food Programme and making food gets to the most acute crisis areas, generally the likes of Burundi or Uganda, where they're dealing with mass refugee crisis stemming either from Eastern DRC or South Sudan or Somalia. So those are sort of the main ticks of where we're trying to do it. I'll be quite frank, when we talk about UN programs and aims, they're all at risk, Paddy. They're all at risk of not being able to stay going forward. When I was with the World Food Programme depot in Dar es Salaam, they had enough food till July. And there was sacks and sacks of USAID branded bags, but they didn't know what was going to replace them. So it is a little bit more perhaps pressing and a little bit more blunt than perhaps previous needs in terms of just getting the funding and the resources to where it needs it the most as quickly as possible.
And just on that question of the overall kind of envelope of funding that you have available, Ethna McDermott, who's a member of the IAA, has put a question in on the Q&A asking whether and to what extent the USAID decision has, had a bearing on your setting of priorities. I mean, has it altered the allocation or the plans in relation to allocation or reallocation of priorities and funding within that envelope, or have you has that been required? Have you required to look at that again in the light of the American decision?
The short answer is no. The not so short answer is not yet, to be quite frank. And I chose to reference maternal health in a bit of detail today, not because we're changing our priorities or we're redirecting resources, but perhaps it's redirecting the narrative to just explain when someone's going through a funding document with a word search for gender, women or girls, that's nothing to do with actually helping maternal health. It's about a DEI agenda that an anti-DEI agenda that is really concerning for me, to be honest. And I think that's why we need to push back in terms of a narrative on that basis to say this is what this actually represents. And we can already see the profile of the parliamentary questions that are coming in by some members. They do have very much an ideological bent, and they're more than entitled to this, don't get me wrong. But it's, do you want to talk about maternal health, or do you want to win, an argument that I would argue was resolved some years ago? But in terms of funding envelope and our priorities, it's still the same as of now. As I said, I'm quite bolshy in terms of I'm going to be asking for more money, but I suppose every government minister can say that in the month of May. It's when you get into the whites of the eyes the deeper that things change a little bit. But we'll try our best at this stage. And I think it is really important that how we react, the cutbacks that we've seen, we thought the worst of it would be probably we would see it next year or the year after, but we're starting to see it now. And we're starting to be able to work with our international NGOs, the large ones here, to see where those impacts are, both on a regional point of view as well as a thematic point of view. But I would argue, in terms of the United States, the biggest concern, quite simply, is that there's no plan. It's an executive order, and that's just led to chaos and a little bit of wishful and hopeful thinking for those who are the victims of those cuts. With our European Union partners and indeed our British friends, it's a slightly more managed process. I don't particularly like it, but at least it's a little bit more managed, that you can provide that element. And what we're trying to really underline is, one, the amount of our funding is committed. We're open to agility with our partners to make sure that they can react, that it's not too rigid and they're not hamstrung, but also that we can be relied upon, that will provide multi-annual funding, that it's a guaranteed response.
I think there was a question here. And then Caoimhe, yeah.
Jane Ann McKenna from DOCUS. So thank you very much, Minister. That was really heartening, not only your commitment to ODA and hopefully increasing it as per the programme for government, but also really to the commitment also to the furthest behind. And I think my question is really around the Foreign Affairs Council earlier this week. So we know obviously individual member states are pulling away and reducing their aid budgets, but it's also, at the European level, we're seeing, a lot of questions now under threat really around, merging of different instruments, looking at within the MFF, whether or not human development can be included. So we're really seeing a move away collectively in Europe around this. And I think my question is just like, from the meetings this week, are you seeing any other member states that are a little bit more aligned with Ireland on this? Where are you seeing kind of opportunities with other member states in terms of, or perhaps chinks of hope in terms of where we can actually focus and work with others and try to build back that confidence in ODA?
If you don't mind, I might take 2 or 3 together at this point. Deirdre Cos-McCor, Michelle. What's up?
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. That was an excellent speech. And I think there's very much a shared and common agenda in terms of what you have laid out and what we in the NGO sector would see as important. Maybe just 2 questions. One area that you didn't touch on, which is really core to Irish Aid, is the whole area of civil society space. And I think it will be good just to hear you reflect on that, because I think a lot of what you describe as being critically important in terms of ensuring that services get delivered to those most in need of them. It does also, to a great degree, depend on there being an enabling environment in the countries in which those services are delivered, in order that you have democratic governance, respect for human rights, and that the institutions of those states function to the support of the citizens. And again, this is also around dependency. We have seen what's happened as a result of the pulling away of aid when institutions are weak. So I wonder if you could comment on Ireland's continued commitment to civil society space. The second question really is, and this is not an ad, but Trócaire just launched a policy report this morning called Fueling Injustice, around Ireland's role in the fossil fuel industry. And I suppose, look, it's true to say we've seen the results of the EPA analysis yesterday, which shows how short we are falling of our own commitments and targets in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And the whole area of climate change is an area where it transcends boundaries. And so it's great to hear that we're going to have a strong agenda at the COP. I suppose my question is, at this point, ODA and traditional forms of finance, they just aren't absolutely inadequate in terms of dealing with the climate emergency. So to what degree would you believe that the whole government, because this goes beyond your department, is open to discussions on new and innovative forms of finance, particularly those forms of finance that tackle the source of the problem, which is fossil fuel companies and their excessive profits?
In case anybody didn't recognize, that's Cuiva de Barra Trócaire. And this man over here was next. Yeah.
Christian Font, Deputy Head of Mission at the Spanish Embassy. Thank you, Minister, for the interest and commitment towards the UN Conference on Finance and Development in Seville at the end of June, and for your intervention. You have mentioned the need for alliances, for more alliances internationally, to boost the effective development. And my question is related to the situation and prospects around public sector and private sector alliances. SDG 17 has been a push in the last years for more effective collaboration and more innovative ideas, in the cooperation between the public and private sectors. And I would like interested to hear from you about the Irish experience and the prospects and the ideas that may come in Seville in the conference too. Sure. Thank you.
Because we have a number of other people who've indicated, I will come to them. I might have a few online here, so we might sort of quicken the pace a little, and so that we can get as many in as we can.
I don't know, Jane Ann asked about the multi-annual financial framework. There's no chance I'm going to quicken that pace.
Yeah.
It's glacial at the best of times. Yeah, just in relation to the stance of member states, and you talked about alliances, very convenient that our friend from Spain, Christian, was the most recent speaker, because they're a really important ally, really, really important, Slovenia as well, on a range of issues. Look, I was in the room in the Foreign Affairs Council and I was really, really worried, to be quite frank. I'm really worried that there's about 3 or 4 of my ministerial colleagues who seem to relish in the aid cutting agenda, who are from a very clear ideological political bent, perhaps part of a coalition government, not necessarily in line with their senior minister, but they're quite blunt in what they're trying to achieve. That's looking at member state commitment. And you can only control the controllables. We can control our own budget, and I've been quite clear what I want us to achieve. In relation to the EU, it's a little bit different. Ireland is a signatory, along with Spain and a number of other countries, to a non-paper where we made it quite clear ahead of the multi-annual financial framework talk of our commitment to making sure there's a distinct development instrument and it's maintained. Realistically, we'll get our first communication from the Commission in July with a sort of options paper in terms of where things are going. And I would have made an intervention, and I'm more than happy to say it on the record, even though we were in closed meeting at the time, is there is a big push to move towards global gateway as somehow that's a replacement for aid. It's not. Secondly, there is rhetorically a lot of conflating the absolutely righteous support for Ukraine with development. It is humanitarian work, it is development, but you've seen from our figures, we've kept that 810 million very separate to our support of Ukraine, because they are very different, distinctive approaches. So that's the lie of the land at a European Union level, both in terms of member states and the union itself. So I wait for July with quite a deal of reticence. And I might just jump to Christian's question first and then come back to you, Caoimhe. Don't worry, I'm not dodging. In relation to Seville, which I'm going to attend, I'm really looking forward to it. A bit worried about the 42-degree heat, but that'll come into Caoimhe's question in a second. I think this is going to be the big opportunity about how we leverage private funds and private sector support. But we have to put at the heart of that is, again, not a replacement from state-based development programs. And that's something that I'm very wary of. I want to be very blunt. Absolutely up. And we had a really good engagement with the Global Fund yesterday on HIV, malaria and tuberculosis, who've been able to leverage absolutely philanthropic actors to provide an element of new funding and sustained funding. But we have to be aware that nothing will replace multinational institutions, individual countries and governments, their program. So I go into Seville with an open mind, and I think Ireland has a good story to tell, and certainly our agencies do. But we have to coax that this isn't the silver bullet. In relation to Caoimhe, yeah, absolutely. Probably should have got into a bit more detail with civil society space in my remarks, but I think I made a few references to it without getting into the direct, because this could have taken up 25 minutes alone. Our support, of course, for civil society organisations, both in country and Irish agencies who work to support them, will be unwavering, because it is so important. And we've seen that at a really interesting engagement in Liberia with members of the frontline defender community who are largely representing the LGBT plus community. There's 3 pieces of draft legislation in front of the Liberian House of Representatives that want to introduce anti-LGBT plus legislation akin to what is in place in Uganda. And it's how we engage with them in a manner as a country who's been welcomed in to have a diplomatic presence. It is very difficult, and you know this better than I, to make sure that you're not seen to be coming in with untoward outside influence. But we do provide the support financially, morally, of course, but also provide the space to make sure that those organizations are protected and will continue to be protected, because that level of civil society engagement goes to the heart of the questions that people traditionally have with development program. How can we trust this money is being spent right and in the right places? And if you have a strong civil society sector, that makes sure that the institutions of the state that you're working in are up to par. So absolutely. As Alex alluded to in my introduction, I've been in most government departments in the last 3 years, including finance. And I think it's really, really important that we are able to separate our work on the Loss and Damage Adjustment Fund and climate finance from our development budget. And the two don't cross over, they are separate, and there's separate funding streams. And we're continuing to supporting that. And our climate finance scheme is absolutely rock solid. It's gone up, it will continue to be a central part. And certainly, I think we're going to come out of COP in November with an earful, to be quite frank, about where the developed world is failing. The developing world most is the impacts of climate change. You say they impact everyone. They don't impact everyone equally. Those in the developing world are impacted the most. And when you talk about a situation where crops are failing, where there's drought, where there's extreme weather events, that is driving the biggest concern of the very politicians who are eagerly and enthusiastically cutting aid budgets. When they're talking about irregular migration and using language that I never would and I find repulsive, they fail to recognize that, yeah, by cutting your aid project, you're actually fueling the very issue that you've been elected on a background thinking that, you know, Fortress Europe is going to solve everything when it clearly isn't.
Woman in the very corner there. Can I just have us, just get us, before you start, there's a man there. Anybody else thinking? There's two gentlemen there and a woman over there. Yeah, okay, just to get a sense. We'll see, depending on how complex the questions are, shall we say, we might take all four together or we might split it up a little bit. But the woman at the back.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Maria Shea. I was until February this year working for an international development NGO in Washington. My question actually, it links to the previous one about civic spaces. And so one area where USAID was a very, very significant donor was media development. And that is one area that has completely and utterly been annihilated. So all the funding for community radio stations in South Sudan, or for independent journalists who have had to go into exile because they're reporting on, corruption or, in really closed and closing contexts. So you talked about democratic resilience being a really important and key thing. And I think support to media development is one really, really solid way to do that. So I'm just curious, is that something that Irish Aid would consider maybe, because that is such a crucial gap now globally that a lot of donors are suddenly looking at. And I'm just wondering if you would consider it. Thank you.
Really don't want to curtail people, but I'm conscious of the time. No. And I know people would like to elaborate the point for the question. That I completely
to save time, I can answer that question directly. We do it already. Okay. I signed off on the funding this week. You'd have seen some reports on RTE from Zambia in relation to GBV. That's funded by Irish Aid. So we're funding media to not only tell the tale, but also in country to support independent media organizations to make sure that they are able to work in very different situations. So a short answer I could give you, hopefully as positive what I could give you.
Great question, yeah. Yes, sir.
I'll keep it very short. Rohan Radia from the British MC. Minister, thanks very much. Really interesting speech. I noticed that Ireland have the chair of the Nordic Plus grouping. Wondering what your priorities for that are. And I guess the broader question, if I had a bit more time to elaborate, would be in the face of opposition within the EU, as you say, and obviously USAID cuts, are there kind of other groupings or alliances that you'd be looking to make on the development front?
This man here, just because you're nearby and the microphone could reasonably quickly go over. Sorry. Sorry, Lauren.
Hi, Kevin Trott, Department of Defence. I'm also a goalie with Goal Next Generation, so I really support your work on behalf of Irish Aid there too. Kind of two questions jumbled into one here. Going back to the UN here, I suppose yourself and Ireland in general, how concerned are you with the UN Security Council, just especially in relation to vetoes by the permanent members, how that can really block coordinated responses to crisis and really undermine development financing? And in a broader context, do you support a reform of the UN development system in relation to governments and financing mechanisms? Thank you.
I will come to the woman over there, but those two questions, can I just add one from online? Katrina Dowd says a huge barrier to aid effectiveness is physical obstruction and even attacks on humanitarian aid in conflict zones. What political and diplomatic measures can Ireland take to reduce these and strengthen accountability for violations of international humanitarian law? Sorry now to give you three in a row, but...
No, and I'll start with Katrina's because I had a meeting with Dominic Crowley from Concern yesterday, who made a very pertinent point. It has never been more dangerous to be a humanitarian worker. And there are less humanitarian workers working in the most exposed areas because it's so dangerous. So the proportion of humanitarian workers that are at danger, and we can talk about Gaza, we can talk about South Sudan, we can talk about Eastern DRC, all areas where aid workers are not just at risk, they're dying and they're being killed. And I think this is something that is really worrying. And we make the point quite clearly that maintaining access to humanitarian corridors has to be key. And we've done that particularly in relation to the Great Lakes region in making sure that we can get access points to make sure humanitarian aid can get to the furthest behind first. In relation, Ryan, to your question about the Nordic Plus, Nordic Plus ain't working great at the moment in relation to development, to be quite frank. Norway, great partners, great friends. All the others are great friends, by the way, but their political interest in development is very, very stark. And I mentioned certain ministers' interventions at the Foreign Affairs Council where they were talking about how to change the focus on development and indeed how cuts are nearly being championed. Some of those would have come from our partners in the Nordic Plus. It's really, really worrying. And therefore it requires generally, and I'm aware I'm not over European affairs, so I don't want to go straight too far, but our approach to alliances within the EU are very sectoral now. They're not necessarily a geographic one, and they're not necessarily a linguistic one, but they are, depending on the issue, and it can go from everything from climate to taxation, to development, to the situation in Gaza, to our response to tariffs, they're all based on alliances. And we have our largest deployment of diplomats at the moment over not one, but two permanent representative buildings, not just because we're preparing for the presidency, but because the nature of alliance building is changing ever more so. And it's hugely exciting, but it's extremely, extremely difficult. Kevin, in relation to UN reform, more generally, more broadly, in terms of Security Council, Ireland has been very outspoken, along with a number of other European Union partners, of the need to involve more African countries in the UN Security Council. Europe and Africa together represents 40% of the General Assembly. We've seen in the G20 an increased African presence, particularly under the South African presidency, has been wholly positive. We need to see that more at a UN level. When we're talking about the most disadvantaged areas in the global south, it is largely within, not exclusively, but largely within sub-Saharan Africa. So within that UN 80 process, there is an opportunity for greater UN Security Council reform. My biggest concern, which I touched upon very, very briefly, is there is a distinct lack of urgency in that UN 80 reform. I fear by the time we agree on reforms, it might be too late for some UN agencies. And then we're absolutely supportive of the UN development system and making sure that the agencies are supported. So our funding contributions would have fallen this month in May, but we actually brought them forward to February in order to provide those supports. My first trip to Geneva, I did the full tour de table of UN agencies, and it was interesting. Every meeting you go, oh, it's great that Ireland's here. I've just had Iran, Russia's next. There's no difficult conversations, which is a nice space to be in, but it just highlights how precarious the situation is.
There was a woman over there that indicated, and then over here as well, just in the middle, the two together, at least let's chill in there.
I'm Mary Corbett, nutritionist with Self Help Africa. And I'm just really concerned, and I'm just curious. Food insecurity is increasing dramatically. Malnutrition is increasing dramatically. We shouldn't have emergencies and developments, but we do, whether we like it or not. We kind of supposed to have the nexus, and they're supposed to be merged and joining. But my huge concern is that one will be lost to the other, and in some ways, development will be lost to emergencies, because in some ways you have to respond to acute emergencies. It's so visible and it's so important. But development is equally so important, because if you don't address development, then it will end up being emergency. So it's a kind of a circular, serious issue. And I suppose as us as a country, how can we advocate or mitigate so that potentially it doesn't deteriorate dramatically and become a major crisis? And maybe we can't do anything, but I'm just curious what you think about that. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. Just there. Yep.
My name is Carmel Urandust, and I'm working at the Irish Aid Centre on Clonmel Street. And so we have never received so many students and so many primary, secondary student teachers as well, where we talk about the work of Irish Aid. So there's two sayings that we use. The first is that the future is bright, because we can see that our children and young people really grasp some of the complexities of the world today and what's happening politically, economically. And the second is really this African proverb that is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this also resonates. So please forgive me for this question, Minister. I heard you yesterday at the IDEA conference, and I was very impressed by your words. I've been living in Ireland for 10 years, and I've been working in the NGO sectors in World Vision Ireland, also coming from a UN background in New York City. And this 0.7% UN targets has been going on for ages. The 4 only countries in the world that are going above the UN target are Denmark 0.71%, Luxembourg 1%, Norway 1.02%, and Sweden 0.79%. Please forgive me, but what stops Ireland from actually going to 1% of our ODA? Thank you.
Just because we are up on the hour. In fact, we're 3 minutes gone the hour. I don't know how flexible were you with sort of
the school run, so
the school run. Well, then we definitely won't keep you from that. I'm just going to throw in really quickly, not all of the ones that are online, but just really quickly. And don't worry if you don't get up to all of this, but I'll put them in anyway. Breda Gavin-Smith, the reality is that Ireland alone cannot close the financing gap. How can Ireland take a leadership role in advancing innovative financing approaches that begin to address this shortfall? She has another question as well, but I'll leave that. Morton Sabale has a question about, thank him for this question from Malawi on USAID, but we have touched on that, so I think we'll just leave that for the moment, given the time. And Dervla O'Callaghan, European Peacebuilding Liaison Office. At the EU level, development policy is shifting towards the pursuit of geo-economic interests, particularly through the Global Gateway Initiative, which risks leaving fragile and conflict-affected states behind. How will Ireland ensure that its values and the values and commitments enshrined in the EU treaties are upheld in the coming years, particularly as the MFF negotiation progresses?
Brilliant.
There's a lot there now, so you're not going to get to all of it.
No, but I'm going to
do the best you can.
I'm going to rattle through first in relation the question about nutrition and the fact that development is losing out to emergency, but both development and emergency are losing out to defence and security. And it's a misnomer, because you need defence and security when things are less developed and when things are unstable. Ireland is doubling our defence spending, but we're not doing it. It's not a binary choice, and we don't view it to be as such. So to mitigate, we can only mitigate so much, as Breda has mentioned very succinctly, but we can advocate, and we will advocate, and we do advocate. And we advocate, to be quite frank, from a place of humility, because you're dead right. Ireland hasn't reached 0.7% due to political decision. And I own that. I've been a member of a party that's been in government for over 14 years. So I'm not going to go and say it's someone else's fault. And blame me, blame Alex for a few years too. The closest we came to 0.7% was at the time of gross financial crisis, when our GNI just decreased so much. Our actual amount of funding in terms of what it has increased steadily and steadily. You include Ukraine, we're at 0.58%. You take away Ukraine, we're at 0.43%. Nowhere near where we should be. Of the 4 countries you list, I would imagine at least one of them is going to drop below 0.7% in the short term based on the rhetoric. I can't speak for the other 3. I have no reason to believe they're going to change. It'll come down to political choice, and it'll come down to political influence, and it'll come down to pressure. I remember going on marches 20 odd years ago, the Make Poverty History marches, and we were all talking about the SDGs. That was 20 years ago. And when I was shouting into the room, well, now I'm in the room, so maybe I have to take a bit more responsibility for how it gets done. In terms of Breda's point, Ireland alone can't do it, and we do have to be innovative. I suppose I probably touched on that in my response to Cristiano. I would say loads about USAID to Morton, but we don't have that opportunity. But I wanted to finish very pertinently in relation to the shifting in the EU to geo-economic interests. And this is the crucial thing when we talk about our interests versus our values. And I made this point at the Global Ireland Summit that Department of Foreign Affairs hosted a number of weeks ago in Dublin Castle for all our returning diplomats as well as outside external stakeholders. Our interests are our values. By using our values, we achieve our interests. I think too many people don't conflate the two as being related. They're like, oh, no, we have to be more specific about our interests due to global events. But if you actually put your values at the heart of it, and this is where it comes with a very, very recent option before or discussion at the European Union Foreign Affairs Council, when we're talking about how we get aid into Gaza after the 60-odd day blockade, with Israel's suggestion that we can use private entities and we can completely go around the UN system. It took a little bit more work than I expected, but not as much work, just to remind EU member states that this is not a runner. This is absolutely contrary to the European treaties, to the values therein, of not just the EU as a whole, but also the member states. And I think that's something, thankfully, the High Representative Kai Kallas came out of the meeting very clear. And people are talking about, oh, we need to look at blue sky thinking. You don't have blue sky thinking when it comes to development aid. You have very clear values and you have a very clear rules-based system. So I think that is one where we can talk about shifting geo-economic interests, and we talk about the global gateway in an EU process, but we can't allow people talk about global gateway as somehow that's the new version of development, because it has to be an anchor. There is an anchor in Irish foreign policy, there has to be an anchor in EU member state policy, and there has to be an anchor in how the UN does its business.
Thank you very much for the presentation, first of all, which at times I felt you felt the pressure to race through, but we got it, and it was very comprehensive and covered a huge range of issues, as indeed did the Q&A. And I want to thank those of you who asked questions and who participated, but to thank in particular, Minister, for engaging with all of the various issues and categories of issues that are here in this agenda, because it's so extensive. Hope to see you again here at the Institute. We certainly are very keen and interested in working closely, as I said earlier, with Irish Aid on this agenda. It's been one of the core interests of the Institute for many years and will remain so. So once again, Minister Neale Richmond, thank you very much.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.